to talk about today is building a framework agnostic component design system with StencilJS. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about me, just introduction to what I do and how I got into Stencil, then also what StencilJS is, and then we'll actually do a little hands-on creating our first components with Stencil. And actually before that, I'll show how we use Stencil within a framework. So I actually started out in product design, like physical product design. So designing, I went to BYU for an industrial design degree, and in the meantime, while I was working at a design firm, started learning how to develop, and I fell in love with coding because it was like I could ship products to millions of people for like zero manufacturing cost. I'm sure you guys all love that. I went into UX after graduating and worked at Lucid Software for a couple of years, and now I'm a UX engineer at Sworkit. So I basically design and develop their hybrid desktop and mobile apps. So we have an iOS, an Android app, and a desktop app. A little bit about Sworkit. We've been around since 2012. We got on Shark Tank in like 2015, saw a huge spike, and every time Shark Tank re-airs, like we get another big spike in downloads. So we have anywhere between 500 to a million active users monthly, depending on the beginning or the end of the year. Imagine when that spikes. But we have a huge user base, and we have platforms. We all share the same code base. We have, here in the top right is what our current app kind of looks like. We have a desktop app, mobile iOS, and mobile Android app, native iOS and Android app. That's actually hybrid, so it's using the same code base that we use on the web. So today, the app that we've rewritten in 2019 is actually written in TypeScript. It's actually using Stencil under the hood for its components. And then we also use Ionic for our views. So has anyone heard of Ionic here? I'll show you a little bit about what Ionic does, but essentially we can write it in one way, and it'll look like an Android device on an Android phone and look like an iOS, following the human interface design guidelines on an iOS device. And then we use Firebase to store all of our user data. Okay, so what is StencilJS? You go to StencilJS.com. This is their landing page. It's a tool chain for building reusable, scalable design systems to basically build 100% standards compliant web components. So in the Angular world, the React world, when I first started learning development, I learned AngularJS. I was fascinated by the concept of components. Right? You could write one little UI element, and then you could use it anywhere after you've written it that once. The same concept exists in all the frameworks I know, at least. You create a component, you can reuse that component. Lately, now in 2019, web components is actually a standard. So there's a standard to build a native web component without even requiring a framework. So although in the past you had to have Angular, or you had to have React or some other framework to build a component, you can now, with vanilla.js, write a component that is reusable in vanilla.js. However, those components are a little bit difficult to write. And that's why Stencil came in. So they said, we want to build a framework agnostic component system it was actually written by the Ionic team so that they could write Ionic. And they then open sourced it and let everybody else build components as well in the same way. So StencilJS in the wild, oh yeah, that actually is right there. StencilJS in the wild is on Sworkit, that's why I put that there. We use StencilJS on our app. Should we break for food? Yeah. Yeah?
You guys are hungry, sorry, before you get really into it.
Yeah.
And again, there's some fountain drinks out there. Help yourself to it.
Yeah, how can you too?
You didn't even know. Have you really? A lot of these presentations usually end with, and we're hiring, you know.
I'm just saying, like, you suddenly realize that those are opportunities. You're like, oh, wow, that's that thing.
There's like 3 different ones on each play.
I don't remember what it is.
It's like vegetarian.
Like get Slack or something.
I really don't even know. I don't eat Jimmy John's that much, so.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Just remember that you would have slacked me.
Michael?
You were here.
Yeah.
So, pardon my ignorance, but what is Forge? Forge? Yeah. I saw that they like own the meetup group.
Yeah, so it's Forge Utah is the nonprofit that we founded to kind of manage all the meetups that are a separate entity from Weave. Grouping all of the, because before that it was a million little Slacks for different things, and it was hard to keep track of like all the different.
So we've started Forge.
I think so, yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
And it's just any development. They have multiple development sites.
Oh, yeah, yeah, they're they merged some of the other ones that were separate previously. Brought them all under an umbrella.
Yeah.
You're looking to learn, to get in on any of the meetups. There's older people there.
Cool.
I should have asked if anybody had any announcements of their hiring or anything like that. Or if you're looking. Anybody looking? Actively looking right now?
I'm looking.
There you go.
Michael's looking.
You can announce it. HI in Provo.
What's that?
Go Point Systems in Provo is looking for a web developer company. Yep. I'm sure Weave is too, so I don't know who I'm supposed to. Where my well, I know my loyalties are gonna lie with my wife. I love Weave, so.
Weave is kind of pause hiring for right now.
Really?
Until next year.
That's new to me.
About hope.
Oh, okay.
Pretty rare for us to hire from too. One spot just opened up.
There you go. Post it in the. Speaking of the Slack, there's a whole channel for that.
I'm here with STG, and we're always hiring, so
Where are they out of?
it's all late, but we're through the rock now.
SCG?
STG?
STG. Really generic name.
Is that a consultant? I've heard of it before.
Yeah, we hire everybody. I like the whole stack, full stack, front end, back end, JavaScript, Java, .NET. Everybody.
I work for Micro Focus in Provo, and we're hiring too.
Or front end?
Front end and also QA and back end as well.
Cool. What do you have? Which Slack? Expired? Oh. Couldn't ask me about that. That's the only way I could come. Yes. I mean, technically, but.
And I missed, where are you at?
Sworkit. So I work from home. Yeah, we all there's like 10 of us and we all live all over the US. I'm the only one in Utah, so we do like a meetup every 6 months or so. And feel free to interrupt me at any time, like, if you have any questions. This is another app that I'm working on that also uses Stencil. This is a little Stencil component as well as these little drag and drop elements here. This is a budgeting app.
Is that the one using Plaid?
Yeah,
API?
These are little components as well, and then this header as well, this little scroll-away header. The whole app is actually a Stencil. People are using this for Internet of Things as well. Like this is a vending machine built with a web UI, and maybe that's not Internet of Things, but yeah, using web technologies to actually let people order tickets at this subway thing in Switzerland. A couple months ago, Stencil tweeted this out. Apple Music launched their new beta on the web. It actually uses a bunch of Stencil components, including their video player. And then their Apple TV website that went up has over 50 StencilJS generated web components. So Apple's buying into this web component game and things that are built with Stencil as well. It's really cool to see. So how do you actually, what is Stencil on the outside? You basically write them in TypeScript. If you guys were in React, you guys are probably already writing in TSX, or do you guys write in JSX? JSX. Still very similar. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept, but you can write them in TSX. Stencil then basically compiles into web components. This is a little chart I stole off of Josh Roney's website that can then create your own web components that can be used in any framework, right? So this chart shows specifically Ionic Core. So Ionic can be used now. Ionic 4, before Ionic 3, 2, and 1. Ionic 1 was in AngularJS, so you had to use Angular in order to use Ionic 1. Ionic 2 was in Angular, so you had to use Angular 2+. And now you can use any framework with Ionic because they're using Stencil and native web components to do that. So they basically, I said this already, they compile into vanilla.js, and the really cool thing about them is that although not all browsers support, I mean, the majority of browsers do support native web components, but those that don't, they actually have polyfills, and they're dynamically loaded. So you don't have to slow down, top-notch browsers in order to load these unnecessary polyfills. An example of like a full-fledged app is StencilJS, or sorry, is it to-do MVC, right? Here's kind of what it looks like from React loading the full framework, and Stencil. And again, it's because they're offloading a lot of that functionality to the native web components themselves. So you might write a lot in TypeScript, but it comes out as the minimum that you need. The cool thing about Stencil is that it basically, the only thing it requires, basically what it does is it registers like what each of your little component tags are. So their script has to be loaded on every page. All it does is like recognize when those elements are there. So if, for example, if I created a little like test component element, their script knows that if a test component element is something that is a Stencil element, and then it'll dynamically load all the JavaScript for that test component. So you're not actually loading all of the JavaScript for your full component library. It's only loading the JavaScript for the one or two components on the page at a time. So this is what the API looks like. You're writing them in TypeScript. So if you're familiar with Angular, this might look really familiar. You'll have decorators like the component decorator. You also have prop, state, events. You can listen for events. There's an element and a method. So your every Stencil component will have a component decorator, and that's where you call the component, you give it a tag name, you can link to a CSS sheet. I'll show this in a second. Your properties are things that you would pass into a component. So these are not things that they're passed into a component. You can also have them be reflected if state changes on the inside. You can have it change on the prop. But if it's all internal state, you just put that in a state decorator. So in React, it's just this dot state, and you're having to bind state to the component class, right? And then events are things that would emit up. So if you have like a click event that you want to emit up, you can emit an event there. If you have a drop-down component that when it changes its option, it can emit an event as well and emit the value of that event. So basically, anything that you want to pass down is through a prop. Anything that you want to like tell the parent about through an event, and anything that's just internal is inside state. On parent components, you can add the listen decorator to listen for any of those events, and you can also tie into them just within the JSX as well, like on button click or something like that. Element will give you a raw DOM reference to the element. I've only used this in a couple places when I'm using libraries like Stripe, or like if I need to mount something to the element itself, but most of the time I actually don't need this. And then method is something that it's kind of like a prop, but it's a method that can be called from outside the component. So if another component wanted to find it on the page and then call an update method or get a value from it, you can use the method decorator. So here's a component that is a workout page. I'm actually going to jump into the header itself. Right, the header has a prop like a header title, would have a default back button because this header can be used on many different pages. We'll pass in the prop of a default back href. The share options are here, this little share icon. If I don't have share options, I just don't render that icon, don't render the button. And then I can also pass it a background image. So anytime we have content that we want to have this kind of tall, high header with the button on it, we'll use this page header component. And then inside our render function, it looks something like this, where we have a header. This is an ionic component, actually, that then gets wrapped with our Sworkit. So we always prefix our components with SW. So SW page header then has a header title, background image, default href there, and then all our content goes below there. So that would be like our workout list. So it's an exercise list. So using Stencil and other frameworks, you're basically, can someone tell me what Stencil is now that I've told you what it is? Have I done a good job? What do you get from Stencil? Like when I create all these components, what's my output?
Web component?
They're just web components, right? So if I want to use Stencil in another framework, I actually don't need to ask the question, how do I use Stencil in another framework? I ask, how do I use a web component in another framework, right? So for React, you have to do a couple things. Basically, define custom elements. There's a little loader script you can add from Stencil that helps you do that. And same thing with Angular, you have to define custom elements on your app load. Where this actually is really cool, or I think it's really cool, is when you do it just with vanilla JavaScript. So I can load just through Unpackage if I publish it to NPM, or if it's my private repo, I can just save that JavaScript file and import that one JavaScript file from my whole component library. But again, that loader file, this will only include like the minimum JavaScript it needs to identify like my 100 tags. So it's not like I'm loading all 100 of my components on one page just to see just to load one component. So all I got to do is load that one loader file, and then I can use it on my page and it'll render just like you'd expect it to. For example, yeah, go ahead.
So the output is really more than one JavaScript file, right?
Right. So it'll be a lot of files, but the initial file that's loaded is it can dynamically fetch the other ones as needed. In fact, I'll show you what this looks like. So this is me using the Ionic framework, which was again web components that were compiled by Stencil. And what they have you do is you add a module script. So this is for modern browsers that support modules, and a no module script that's going to be a little heavier for browsers that don't support modules. And then they have a global style sheet that they include. So all I've done is loaded 3 things. And has anyone used AngularJS in here? A long time ago. So I remember when I first started coding in AngularJS, it was really cool because I could create a component library, include it like this, a script tag, and then I could basically mess around in a code pen. So like I had a design team at Lucid that we would do that. We had it It wasn't something in production, but it was something that we built to develop fast prototypes. But you can do that now with production things, with production components, and rather than loading megabytes of JavaScript, what StencilJS did, you're only loading the minimal amount for the components that are rendering on the page. And then as a new component enters the page, it'll again dynamically load the JavaScript that's needed to render. So you saw there's only 3 things that I loaded there. In fact, only 2 things are loading on this browser. It'll be the module and the CSS. And because of that, I now have access to like any of these Ionic components. So I don't have any JavaScript here. I don't have any CSS, but I have this tabs app with beautiful animations that all come because Ionic has coded them this way. So these are just vanilla web components. And then I can add another component too on this page pretty easily. Let's just like throw something up here. Sure, in the main, maybe in the main header. So I can add another Ion icon. I think it's logo regular. Their components will all light in here. So they have a bunch of icons as well that you can do. So yeah, I have access to any of the Ionic components, and they have hundreds of these components that I can use if I just look at the documentation or I remember them myself. All from that one little script tag. And just for kicks, I'll show you that this renders pretty fast, right? So it's not loading a whole bunch of JavaScript to do that, and this is inside a CodePen. So I'm also loading CodePen here. Of course, this is Weave's internet, so maybe that's also a factor. All right. I think I'm going to do another demo here in a second. Okay, so now let's build our first component with Stencil. Laptops out if you want to. Does anyone think of a component you'd want to build? A drop-down component, some sort of UI, simple UI thing. If not, I'm going to do a drop-down.
Tabs,
Tabs? We could do tabs. That might be a little more complicated than I want to take on right now. We'll do a popover or like a drop-down.
You got rid of that?
So all I did was I went to webcomponents.dev. I can go back just to show you. Webcomponents.dev lets you build components in the browser. You could start with any of these little starter packs. You could also do something with Angular or Vue. But I think this does a good job of illustrating how Stencil works. So I'm going to change a few things here just because they don't really follow the standard. So I'm going to call this Cory M. And then my class is just going to be drop down. And then down here, so you'll see that if I click save, nothing will render now because my tag is nowhere on the page. I'm actually going to put it here. We're going to say, here's my component. And now it'll show up there. And if I change this to Cory, it'll update up there. So, the other thing you can do with Stencil comes out of the box ready for Shadow DOM support. So if you're not familiar with Shadow DOM, it's like, think of an iframe, but in terms of a component. So it basically encapsulates all of your styles so that nothing from outside of your component will mess up your styles to your component. So it's great for component libraries because you've specified how your button should look or your drop-in should look, and all of your other devs can do whatever they want with the CSS on the page, and they won't mess up that drop-down. We'll leave shadow on for this one, and then typically you'll use a style URL rather than styles, but this is nice because it's all on one page, so we're going to leave that there. And then I'm not going to reflect to attribute because I don't need it. So just similar to React, we have a prop that we can pass in. We have a render function. This will look very familiar if you've done React before. And this render function I'm going to throw into a couple lines because we're going to do some things with it. Hello. And then Right now, if I click on it, nothing happens. But what I want to do is have another state of like, we'll just say like value, and we'll say it's a string. I just got to import that up here. And then we'll get rid of that in a second. So it doesn't scream at me. Okay. So my value, there's no value in it right now. If I save this guy, nothing's going to be rendering. If I can set default values, like Cory, and save it, and now it'll render below here. And this state can change, right? So what I want to do is on clicking at this button, I can just add a new function here. This is how we bind methods to our onClick function. And we're just going to call this click handler because it's easy. Formatter works. That's good. Okay. So on click, I want to have another, in fact, I probably want to do this as value, but we're going to leave it as value for now. We're going to call it like whether it's open or not, right? It's open state. So if we're doing a little drop down, it's going to be either visible or not visible. So I'm just going to call this open. It's going to be a Boolean. I'm going to set it equal to false at first. And when I click on this button, I want it to toggle open or closed, right? So I'm going to say this dot open equals the opposite, this dot open. And rather than render value, I'm going to render this open. So that we can at least see this guy updating, and I got to stringify this. So now as I click on it, it'll toggle. So you'll see that all it's doing, anytime you change a state, it's going to re-render, similar to React when you call, is it like an update state method or something? Or just anytime you assign state, it just does it automatically. Yeah. So it's got a little, React's got a little magic in there in the framework, and they do that with the decorators here. So if I were to take this decorator away, you'll notice that it won't re-render. Even though the value is changing, it won't re-render. In fact, should I change that somehow? No, just trust me. But as soon as I add state, then it'll cause a re-render, and that value will change. Okay, so when it's open, I can do the same thing that I do in React. I can say if this is open, I'm going to render this div. And if it is not open, I'm going to return nothing. And inside this menu, we're going to put in a list of things. So you only have one choice. So now when I click on it, I can toggle this open and closed, right? And then I can do the same thing on these LIs, or I can do another thing on these LIs, which is on click, I can then change its value. On click, I'm going to say this dot, we're going to call it a choice handler. And we're going to say this dot value equals, and for kicks, I'm going to just pass item 1 into here.
Adding handler to the name, something they suggest or something you do?
That's something I do when I'm in front of people who know what to call it. So now if I click on this guy, choice handler, this value string, Cory, Oh yeah, I'm not rendering it anymore. So now let's render the value instead of, because we know if it's open or not because we can see that. Now we want to render the value below. So now if I click on it, I can see that selected state. So of course on this handler, I can also close it. So this dot open equals false. And then I can do the same thing that I do in React. Let's actually do this too. I'm going to pass it like some choices. And I can map over these choices. That's when I'll, let's put this here. And so my choices right now, I'm just going to make an array of strings 1, 2, 3, 4. This dot choices. And now I can map over this guy. And rather than hard coding that, we're gonna write the choices. So now I'm basically looping through every choice, right? I'm returning an li item. On click, I'm gonna pass it that choice variable so that I can set the value to that choice. And I'm also rendering the choice inside the li. And if I save that guy, I open it, now I have 4 choices. When I click on it, it'll close and show me the choice. So what I'd actually do, so because if you were a developer wanting to consume this component, this drop-down component, you probably want an event emitted up, like, hey, what was the choice selected? And then the choice would actually, rather than be handled internally as a state variable, it'd probably be passed in as a prop, so that like in a form, I could pass its default value. So the default value would be like choice 1, right? So I'm actually going to change this to a prop. And the value is going to be one of these choices. And if I was really good, I'd type these as well. So I can know that it was a type of 1, 2, 3, or 4. But I'm just going to call it a string. And my default value is going to be 1. So for starters, it'll obviously show 1 for a default value, and then 3 when I change it. But I'm still changing that. That should throw an error. I think the console's probably erroring at me because what I'm doing is I'm changing the value of a property of a prop, which I shouldn't do unless I declare like this is a mutable prop, which you can do. I just say mutable true. But the typical practice is to not change the property, but emit the event up and let the parent component handle its state. So if you're using Angular or React, you'd let that two-way binding happen within the framework. So I would then call an event. So we'll create an event, and this is like change. What are we gonna call this? Yeah, change event. This is an event emitter. That's the. And I also need to pull in the event. And then I can type it by saying its value is going to be a string. So now anyone that's consuming this component knows that this change event is actually going to emit a value with a string on it. And then so now my choice handler, rather than setting the value, I'm just going to say this dot change event dot emit, and I'll pass its value of item. So there we go. But you'll notice what's going to happen now is because I don't have a parent component doing anything with that, the state never changes because there's no parent component that's like listening for that change. So is this interesting? Should I build a parent component that listens? Should we move on?
You click the events tab,
Do what?
the bottom right, the events. You should be seeing those, right?
This guy?
Oh, sorry, just next to HTML, there's a, right in the middle of the white section.
Oh, this is right.
Yeah, I was just curious to, theoretically, right, should be seeing, I don't know, I just thought that's what that was for. I was just curious.
Yeah, I don't know.
Who knows what that's for?
I don't know what that's for. I've
Not for events, that's for sure.
I've started using Sworkit recently. web components.dev.
I'm just curious.
Okay. For kicks, I'm just going to do this real quick. I think this will be fast. So we're going to make a parent component. So we're going to say this is like you typically consume this in your framework of choice, right? For this one, we're just going to wrap this guy in this component. So this is going to be CM parent. And then I'm going to get now we're going to move the state here, right? So I want my choice to be one of these values. We're just going to let its default. Actually, we're not going to set default yet. And there's no props. There's no choices. All we're doing is, oh, in fact, let's do this. Let's do this even. Let's not put CM drop down here. Let's actually do it here, right? So now this name can actually be controlled by the parent, but I'm actually not using a name anymore, right? I'm using, well, I had the name, but I'm actually using the value. So let's pass, sorry, say that again?
The name's still on the button.
Oh, so we do want the name on there. We'll leave it, we'll name it Cory still. But we can pass its value equal to my state variable here, which is choice. Let's just verify this is rendering still. So everything's still rendering. We have an event coming up, even though it doesn't know about it. I don't have a choice handler on this component. I don't have a click handler. What I want to have is a listener. And this is going to be, actually, I'm not even going to use listen. I rarely use listen. What I do is I just bind right onto it by calling. I can, just like on click, I can look at this event here and I can camel case it. So I can say on change event. And then I can pass it my event. Then I can say change handler, right? And now I can of course, I just make sure it's working. And if I have a console somewhere, maybe it'll console for me. Where would that be?
Up tab.
Well, we're gonna watch the real console, see if it shows up there. There it is. So there's our event, there's our detail value is 4, right? So now I can basically say this dot choice equals e dot detail dot value. And so now I'm emitting that event up. I'm caching in the parent component, and the parent component is handling the state and passes it back down to the child component so that it knows what value to render. Maybe. Oh, maybe I can save it. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. And so now I can actually pull this default value off as well, since my parent is handling the default value. And yeah, my name is still handled by the parent component as well. So there you have it. We have, oh, maybe I didn't set, oh, that's right, I didn't set the default value. I told you I was going to later. So there we go. Default value is 1. There's my little drop down, my heinous drop down, but we got it working. So pretty simple API. Props go down, events go up, state is just internal. Sometimes I use listen. The only times I use listen is when I don't have access to the direct child. Maybe if it's like 3 components in and I just want to listen for that component change. And then I'll use listen. And method I've rarely ever used. But
How do you listen to the name of the event camel cased?
Say that again.
How do you listen to the event?
What does the code look like? This is text.
Sorry, I just lost that last tab. Now I don't know how to open it.
Control Shift
It should be right here. Reopen, close tab. But it just, Usually it's on right click.
Yeah. 'cause
Okay, so
unique to the top.
say that again. How do I listen to what?
So you bound your listener directly to in line there.
Yes.
How do you do it with your listen decorator?
Okay, so with the listen decorator, let's just pull this guy off and just say, listen. This will be changed. You name it whatever you'd like. New val. Yeah, this should be, I think this is the event that comes up. Let's save us the console. Classic, right? I'm going to import listener here. And I want to listen to this change event. Change event. Saved. Worked. So it just matches the name of your event. Only if you're binding down here would you use the on change event. The on change event there. And stencils.
Would you run into a conflict with the two?
With the two? Let's see. I don't think it's, no, events bubble up, so I think they'll both be called, but we can test that theory right now by saving this and trying to. So there it worked and it set it to 3. So it's gonna, so I can have, if I have multiple listeners on the page, multiple parents, then all of them could listen to that event being changed and they could all react to however they need to.
I mean, you have to keep your event names really unique, so they don't conflict. You have two components that have the same event.
So there are ways. Stencil's got some really good documentation for that kind of thing, but you can specify a specific component emitting a certain event.
Okay.
So for example, Ionic does ion change, on ion change. But if you wanted to listen to a specific component, you can do that as well. So where are we at? Events. And I'm assuming listen is in here as well. Yeah, there's listen. So you can do to do completed. There's your event name. There's your options. Yeah, there's your target. So inside options, you target the component itself. So if it was inside just a specific child component, you wanted to listen to this change event, you can do that there. I'm actually not sure what capture or passive does, but I'm sure that's documented somewhere. But yeah, what I typically just don't worry about it, and I bind them in line. That way, if I change something in my event that gets emitted, like this doesn't that will fail silently if I change my component, my event name, right? Because it's listening for change event, and if I change my change event name, it doesn't know. So I like binding them down here so that if I ever change it, my TypeScript's going to fail. It's going to scream at me and say, hey, on change event does not exist on CM dropdown. Okay, so I'm just going to close up here. And you can start your own project just by doing npm init stencil. It'll prompt you with 3 options. You can either create your own component library, you can create your own PWA with stencil, because essentially what all of our frameworks are is a root component that has child components. So you can build a full app with stencil if you want. In fact, that's what Sworkit is. Our whole app is just stencil. Then we use Redux for state management, but it's not, we don't actually use a framework. And then once you've created that repo with npm init stencil, there's then also another command of stencil generate that you can do to create a folder, the TSX file that you need, and then it'll also prompt you, do you want to create a CSS file or spec file, and it'll pre-populate those with what they need. So it's pretty easy, fast getting started, and they've got great documentation and awesome support, awesome Slack group. So there's always a bunch of guys that are answering questions and things like that on it. Any other questions?
I had a question kind of about your flow, and I might have missed this.
Yeah.
So you're saying you're using Ionic for mobile?
Yeah.
And then you use Stencil to create the components that Ionic then uses?
So, great question. I'll show you some code. This is my my budgeting app. So it's basically a stencil component. So my budget app is a web component, and it has child components that are pages, but there are lots of UI elements that I don't want to have to code. So like drop downs, tabs, side menus. Those are components that I get from Ionic. So I'm using another web component library to integrate into my component library.
Gotcha.
And then I built some of my own components as well, like those little drag and drop transactions, as well as the little budget bars, right? Those are all unique components. But like the main UI, like I can show you some of this too. So these are all Ionic components. This little drop down is an Ionic component. This drop down, same thing, an Ionic component. Then we have, these are stencil components that I built. There's web components. This is Ionic components because they're tabs across the bottom. So it's a combination of both the Ionic and the stencil. And then like, this is me pitching Ionic for a second, but you'll notice as I refresh, emulating an iPhone, this looks more like iOS design, where it follows the human interface design guidelines. It has, it actually is a really small phone, but it has the page transitions slide in from left to right or right to left. Your tabs don't have any kind of animations on them, but if I refresh on a standard browser, this is going to be more material design with our ripple effect. Page transitions are sliding up from the bottom versus right to left. So does that answer that question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ionic's come a long way.
Yeah, it really has. I remember because the reason I even like learned Angular was just because Ionic was on AngularJS, and then I learned Angular 2 because Ionic upgraded to Angular 2. So, so yeah, that's where it's at. Any other questions?
So you're adding these Ionic stencil web components. Where do you find where these are and how do you add them to your project?
Where do I find Ionic components?
Or components, I mean, there's lots of stencil components out there, I'm sure. So how do you find the component that you want to use? Because I don't know, you're not going to build every single one of them yourself.
So the only components I currently am consuming that aren't built by me are Ionic components.
You just know those because you've used them before.
I've used them before, and they also have really great documentation. So I just go to their component library that has all of them. I'll be like, oh, I want a card thing. And as I search card, here's a card, and this is what it looks on iOS. This is what it looks like on Android.
So if you want to add the card to your project, how do you do that?
So it's because this is all a stencil component library. All I did was import the one repo, npm repo of Ionic.
And then you have access to everything.
Access to everything. But again, it only lazy loads the ones that it needs when they're on the page. So even though there's hundreds of Ionic components, if I only use 4, I'm only going to be loading the JavaScript for the 4. Well, in fact, I'll only load the JavaScript for the one that's on the page, but I'll have within my repo like the 4 piled JavaScript.
You jumped around from page to page. Would you actually see it pulled in with other components?
Yeah, so if you don't have, so on first load, yeah, so I use Service Worker to cache everything. And then I do like infinite caching because they have hashes for all the files that are saved. So basically on the first load, yeah, you'll see like some things load in at different rates. But after that, it feels like totally native. It just is like smooth and fast. And then you can pre-render them as well.
So you're saying all the Ionic components are stencil components? Is that right? Or
They're web components. They were built by Stencil.
they're built
yeah,
by stencil?
but they are web components. Yeah. Yep. And that's the really cool thing I like about Stencil is that the guys that are building it are consuming it in like the way that you want to use it. They're building their own design framework, or sorry, their own design library. So everyone else that's building their own design libraries can follow their example because they have great documentation. They've used it in and out to do all the same things you're trying to do. So
There's not like is it iOS and Android, I guess?
yeah, it's material design.
Material design, okay. Is that like Android and web, right? Or
Yeah, so material design guidelines it's Google's theory, right? So by default, most web applications are going to be in material design, but you can override it if you want. You can make it iOS. and then it'll detect the platform. So like on my iPhone, when I open my PWA, it'll show up and it'll look like the iPhone following the human interface design guidelines.
Does Stencil give you some PWA things, utilities?
If you're building a PWA, yes. So they have in fact, I'll just show you real quick, like you can do, if we do that npm init stencil, let me do this out of here. So if I do npm init stencil, I have 3 choices. I can do an ionic PWA, an app, which will be like a root component and then other pages, or just a component library myself. So a collection of web components. So what I just presented on was a collection of web components, but you can do an ionic PWA that'll come with a service worker and those types of things. And I think it comes with the ionic library already there, but that's a simple import anyway. So you can do both. Right.
Who's backing? Is it Ionic backing Stencil?
Yeah. Yeah, so they're the guys behind it. For a while there, they do have a professional design systems like upgrade for enterprise guys. I don't know exactly what's included in that. Where is that? It's like StencilJS. It might be a different StencilJS. I think it's a different website. StencilJS. Is it Stencil Design Systems? Like there isn't, right there, DS. So they sell like professional services and stuff and other things that you can do, like what was the one? Findings, automated documentation generation, visual regression testing tools, like these kind of things that might be more enterprising, I guess. But you can do a lot of it yourself as well. So they're just really just giving you a fast track to get those kind of things built. Tested. All right.
Cool.
That's it.
Nice.